I don't forget. Maybe we have 2 people here who weren't last time. So do we want to do just a quick round of introductions? Like just, hi, I'm me. I will start. I'm Sharon. Welcome everyone. And then we'll just tag the next person. So I will tag Gerardo.
Hi everybody, I'm Gerardo Blanco, currently in Boston. It's so good to see you all, and just really happy to be here. And if I may, I would like to tag Blanca. Hey.
Hi everyone, I'm Blanca. I'm currently in Chicago University. What's my institution? Loyola University, Chicago. And I'll tag, how about Elizabeth?
Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Buckner and I'm currently in Toronto. Sorry, I was moving. I don't know who, okay, I will tag Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm in Vancouver also at UBC, and looking forward to the rest of our conversation today. And I will tag someone I don't know well, which is Stuart.
You're muted, Stuart.
I just joined. What am I being tagged with?
Just, who are you?
We're just doing a set of new people.
Yeah, there's new people.
New people. All right. Hi. Sorry. Okay. I'm Stuart. I'm in London in the UK. I work at the UCL Institute of Education. And am I tagging somebody again? Is this okay? Roxana, have you introduced yourself?
No, for this section. Hi, I am a human still. And I am in Makanda, 1 hour away from Port Elizabeth, the land of easy Cosa people. I'm still learning my clicks. And yeah, working at Rhodes University. And I'm gonna tag Gian.
Hi, I'm Gian. I'm here in Vancouver doing an exchange at UBC. And I will tag Kumari.
Hi everyone, Kumari Beck, living in Fort Langley and working at Simon Fraser University near Vancouver.
I will tag for you on your behalf, Kumari. I will tag Tatiana.
Thank you. I'm Tatiana Suspitsina. Hi, Gerardo. It's really great to see you. I'm located in Columbus, Ohio now. I am a faculty member at the Ohio State University. And Amira, have you introduced yourself? I'm gonna tag you then.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Amira Al-Masri. I am from York University, Toronto, Canada. And I'll tag Roopa.
Thanks, Amira. Hi, everyone. Roopa from York University in Toronto.
Okay, how about...
Sorry, I completely forgot. I'm just in my own... Emma.
Yes.
Say who you are.
Oh, sorry. I thought it's almost everybody who is in the morning session. Hi, Amira. It's Emma Sabzalieva here in Toronto. I am finishing my PhD at the University of Toronto. It's lovely to see you all again. I've just been helping a course mate out with her interview protocol for her thesis research. So I've just been a dummy college transfer advisor for her for the last hour, like workshopping her questions. So now I have to get back into internationalization. Anyway, so I hope the rest of the first session went very well this morning. It's good to see you all again. Somebody else put a hand up. Stuart, you have a hand up, or are you just opening a window? Just opening a window. Who's next?
I can go next. I'm Dale.
Perfect.
I'm in Vancouver. And I'll tag Clarissa, who I think also hasn't gone yet.
Oh, hi again. Sorry, I'm connecting and disconnecting all the time. Very unstable internet connection here. I'm Clarissa. I'm talking from Brazil, and I'll try to, stay with you for the whole session, but I might get disconnected again. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll tag Sue.
You're muted, Sue.
Shit, sorry. I'm Sue. Do you hear me kissing Clarissa? I'm Sue, and I'm in the west of Ireland in Galway, at the National University of Ireland, Galway. And who else has not been tagged? I don't even know.
Max.
Okay, well, thank you, Gerardo. I'll tag Max then, yes.
Max Crumley-Effinger. I'm a PhD candidate at Loyola University, Chicago, currently living in Indiana in the US.
Sarah?
I think maybe Sarah's the last one.
Sorry again for being late, second time today. I'm Sarah, and I'm calling in from England.
Lovely. Okay, so would the group like to start the same with the round of just people offering their questions and responses to the videos? Or do you have another vision?
I don't mind if we just start with questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But can I also just surface as a just thank you for this moment, and also to say that this panel, I don't know if Sharon intended that, to us all to be together in the way that our papers kind of come, as they often do, like when you're putting together a panel, they don't always go together. But although I don't know Max yet, I'm just so honored to be on a panel of any sort, virtual or real, with my co-presenters today. So these are some of my most favorite people, as so many of you are, but some very strong emotional attachments to the individuals that we speak with today. So I just want to, as we surface our affective selves, I just wanted to say that I wish we could be together again. I will echo that from last session, but also that I miss you all very much.
Okay, so shall we get started with the round then? Okay, does someone want to start with a burning question or response?
While that is formulated, would anybody be opposed for me if I took a screenshot? Because this image is just like bringing a smile to my face. So please let me know if you're opposed to that, and then I'll just be quiet. But I would, while we're putting up together the questions, I would love to just take this as an equivalent of having a kind of like a group photo of these.
Carissa, can you put your video on just real quick?
Okay, very good. So I'll take it. Okay, thank you so much for indulging me on that.
That was so fun, actually. That's the first group picture I've ever had on Zoom.
If you send it to me, Gerardo, I'll circulate it to the group email.
I know. How do you even do that? I didn't know you could do that.
If you have a Mac, because that's the only way I know how to do it, you do.
Well, pardon me, I don't.
Oh.
No wonder I've never seen it.
But you can do that. You can also press print screen.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been teaching online for years now, and I never knew that. So you always learn something.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a question, Sharon, or if you mind me interjecting, but again, I just wanted to echo, Amy's recognition of like just how fantastic this gathering is, and just being in touch with some of the people that I dearly miss and I have missed for years and years. And it's one of the things that to me personally came to head when during Gerardo and Amy's presentation, how you talked about how all crossings are permanent and all borders internal. And because I think I have felt that way for a long time. You know, I'm, for those who don't know me, I'm originally from Mexico. I got my master's at UBC under Amy's supervision, and then my doctorate in Arizona. And so I'm close to, I think I'm closer to being outside Mexico now than I had lived in Mexico, which is a kind of an interesting prospect, you know, and something that really brings up a lot of things, especially as I think about what internationalization means. And it also makes me think of, you know, what Roopa mentioned in her presentation, that who benefits from internationalization. And for me, you know, in the context of Canada, your presentation really spoke very directly, because you talked about the Canadian Cultural Diplomacy Program, you know, these federal programs for bringing in ideal immigrants, and I was one of them. I had a scholarship from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Canada. That's how I got my my master's. And so, you know, in the last session, we talked a lot about complicities, but also the good that comes out of it. So I have benefited a lot, tremendously, in fact, from being an international student, being an international scholar. And at the same time, if it had not been for that experience, very much like Roxana talked about in her presentation, I never knew I was colonized, first of all. And that I have lost that connection, and I feel now absolutely no claim to what is part of my ancestry, but that has been completely erased by virtue of centuries of violence that have, by the time I came here, I was already part of it, just by virtue of being born where I was born. And so for me, internationalization was always this, I had this very naive notion when I first came into it of, you know, cooperation and stuff. And the more I work in it and learn, I learn to complicate it. But I'm also trying to hold on to what is good about it. And that's hard, except in situations like this, where I look at this room, this space full of people that, you know, I learn so much from. And it's hard not to see the good in it when I do that. So right now I'm just kind of holding those two things together. So thank you all for the presentations, and I'll just leave it at that for now.
So thanks, Blanca. Taking up from there, I was really fascinated with Amy and Gerardo's title, Internationalization is Fatal Strategy. And sort of it linked very well with Blanca's and Max's presentation in thinking about what they consider academic hypermobility, the fatal strategy, which is what they were describing in many ways. So I found those links very, very interesting. I guess going back to Sharon's questions and thinking about internationalization the way we consider it as a vital strategy, how do we even shift from a conceptualization of a vital strategy to a fatal strategy? And thinking about Sharon's questioning about how do you make, I mean, it's, right now, some of these discussions, some seem so unintelligible to people who are invested in internationalization. How do you make internationalization as a fatal strategy even intelligible to somebody who's so invested in it? And so I'm just caught in that, because if you're thinking about rethinking, you know, questioning, getting people in the conversation about internationalization, even considering it as a fatal strategy. Where can we even begin to make it intelligible, considering the whole investment in this enterprise to begin with? So I leave it at that. In terms of, but I was just, you know, I am still at this internationalization as a fatal strategy. I can just see making a presentation at the university where people will be just like shocked out of their wits to think that it could even be considered a fatal strategy. So I loved that, and thank you for bringing that frame in it. So I'm just thinking along those lines, but and I thought that Blanca and Max's presentation was an illustration of exactly that, right? So it was brilliantly done. And the only other comment I would make, sort of related to your presentations in connection with mine, is I just wonder, how did we in the university become so complicit with the state? What were the processes that we went through, and ironically at a time when the state has pulled out? So I'm also wondering, is it public institutions? What in systems like the US where you have private institutions, do you see the same dynamic in terms of the state and the university? And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Hello, hi. So I completely, this resonance between Amy and Gerardo's presentation, Bianca's and Max's also struck me as well, particularly with this imagery of the red hand and then the handprint. And I kind of wanted to draw on that and kind of see about what folks were really thinking about this conceptualization, because I was also struck by what are we grasping towards, right? So when you have this handprint and this footprint, in that conceptualization, the footprint in terms of hypermobility is detrimental. We have this, these ecological concerns, but then also kind of thinking about what are the goals, what are the objectives, right? So how are we complicit in sort of conceptualizing those things in terms of possible violences that we're inflicting? And then I also wanted to link in Roopa's presentation in that the suggestion, at least as far as I understood, or one possible solution with this investment in public intellectuals. But I was also really, that drew up a lot of questions for me in terms of how do we frame thinking critically about ourselves, thinking about our complicities in a way that also sells this fatal strategy. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, thinking critically about yourself is a really hard sell, right? It's not the internationalization as we've talked about it in the sort of, competition frameworks in terms of competitiveness. It's really thinking about, like, talking about disinvesting in internationalization is actually not a way to get folks to be invested in this project. And so I'm kind of wondering, how do we walk that that boundary? And so kind of drawing in all three of those presentations. I think it was a really, really complimentary panel, and I'm curious to hear what folks have to say about this.
Oh no, carry on.
I can't really see who said that, but go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, it's Sue. Did I not? Yeah, it's okay. I just wanted to go on a bit from what Gian just said there, and maybe just to ask a little question about where people see internationalization in relation to this tension between competition and cooperation, and how this relates to this idea of what we are grasping for versus what the footprint of what we do is.
And I was just going to add, in some ways, the definitions of fatal strategies are relatively open. In one of our slides, we even noted that Baudrillard himself says he's used it in different ways, right? So we can begin to make our own sort of sense of this. So it's not necessarily one way of thinking, but as we were looking at it now, we're thinking of it in the context of COVID and the pandemic, as it's a particularly the movements of bodies and the connections are actually very dangerous, right? So we're kind of placing that into this concept of contagion, but also recognition of the ways that contagion have been used specifically to create colonial spaces for insurgents. So there's and for occupation. So there's there's a bit of a sort of foreshadowing in just the ways that historically space has been taken, and the ways that we might now think of internationalization as sort of sitting in that space that it owns today, because of those earlier actions, right? So they're not separated from each other. But also to say that the concept of fatal strategies, in a sense, is like something that in creating an object out of internationalization, something that you can own or commodify or take profit in, or sort of make something to be discussed at a professional development opportunity, for instance, is exactly what makes it eat itself, right? So it becomes a thing rather than a real clear recognition of the underlying processes that have led to it. So we in entangling with it and in engaging with it as an object, as our institutions want to do, like we're going to add internationalization to our courses, we're going to add internationalization to our financial budget strategies. These are ways that it then disconnects us from saying, well, actually, no, this is just colonization in another form, or this is just appropriation or disconnection or disinvestment in another form. So we might then say, well, it's just not. It's like one of these things that we were speaking about in the last session. These are one of the irreparable pieces, perhaps, that we need to think beyond. But the other side of it, with the imagery we were looking at with Posada and the Calaveras and the Calacas, is thinking that in some places, death is much more accepted as are all of our futures, right? Like it's a reality that we don't talk about very much in particular places like the academy, right? Like a recognition of death is not very well understood these days in the academy. So in placing something as, certain processes will outlive us. What do we want to do for our lifetime, for our species, for our moment on this planet? And so there's this other kind of bit that we talked about last time as well, in knowing that it's irreparable, knowing that it's inevitable, knowing that we are all going to die, knowing that the academy will probably continue after our death. What do we do with it now? How do we live within it now? How do we reconcile our own moment and our own potential actions together, collectively, individually? And so there's a bit of that we were trying to portray as well.
Can I go? From what I hear now, the way when Roopa asked how long higher education institutions have been complicit in the affairs of the state, and hearing Amy talk about the creation of spaces where internationalization can enter and develop. And then Sue's question about whether it is collaboration or competition. So in my mind, all of these lines of thinking converge if you think of internationalization as part of governmentality. And that's a Foucauldian notion that looks at governmentality as a technique to govern populations. Well, part of that. And so it is both. So the answer would be in this way: yes, internationalization has always been, higher education institutions have always been complicit with the projects of the state, because that's what they do. They create the population. And today's COVID situation brings up another aspect of what higher education institutions do. And the other side, or the sort of sister concept to governmentality, is biopower. It is controlling or regulating the physical spaces, the physical bodies of participants, sorting people out, categorizing them as healthy or sick or at risk. creating physical barriers to monitor bodies of students, faculty, staff, being concerned about their health and prescribing what health is. So these are the issues, I think, that are all tied together. But perhaps when we talk about whether, if we assume that internationalization is part of the governmentality, of a large issue governmentality, and that is located in the neoliberal, essentially it's a neoliberal tool as well, then perhaps we should ask that to what end do we collaborate and compete? Because governmentality is both, can be violent, but most likely it's insidious, it's enabling. It enables us to become, as Blanca said, a very successful academic without knowing your past, your roots, right? So, and that's what makes us so successful. How we accept, internalize, and accept these techniques of self that makes us academics. So I think that's why the whole exercise of critical internationalization studies is so important, because it turns everything upside down. It exposes the foundation and the power that lies in it, and calls for radical vision of everything. Am I supposed to tag somebody?
No, I can. I think, Tatiana, something you said there is so important, which is this idea of, like, I'm really confronted, right, with like how COVID has brought about some of the most radically conservative ways to be in the academy, right? So I think many of us recognize that there's a lot of university aspects that foment this culture of death, which is no longer a metaphor, right? Like now it's quite literal. But now I'm also confronted with how scary, right? Just from a very personal reflection and thinking about my own complicities and my own hypocrisies, just how comforting it would be not to be worrying about our livelihoods, right? And, you know, how comforting it would be to have financial stability for these institutions that we critique, right? So I think that's just one manifestation. I think there are even more extreme manifestations, which we are seeing, right? With universities essentially no longer recognizing unions as their bargaining counterparts. This is happening in the US, as how most of the plans for what happens in the fall are being made behind closed doors by the president's cabinet, right? With very limited input from faculty, let alone students, right? Or that students are being more and more complying with the role as customers, right? Because the way that they are providing their input about plans for the fall is through surveys and customer service calls, right? Rather than by organizing, building solidarity with each other, or even demanding the rights. So I think this is the part that's really scary to me and understandable too, right? Like I'm really trying to kind of balance both things. And I really think just what worries me is just how quickly the political power, right, that we have as academics, that students have, has been kind of set aside, and then it just becomes a problem-solving exercise and a managerial activity. And I think it's important to verbalize that, because if we don't do that, we're just going to be in this kind of sleepwalking all the way through the next few years.
Can I just follow on, even though I already spoke? Is that okay? The thing about internationalization from where I sit is that internationalization is a strategy that was put in place to assuage the planned death of public higher education. And the policies came about because the state began to systematically withdraw, 10 years ago, the state began to systematically withdraw funding from public institutions to defund them in order to bring about a new landscape where there would be radically fewer institutions, where institutions would be merged and acquired by other institutions in a corporate fashion, and where private providers who had preferential monopolistic deals, technology providers and services providers and private companies, would take over many of the functions of so-called education. And it was also to redirect the educational purpose, the purpose of the institutions, from an educational purpose to a business-aligned purpose to generate knowledge that could be turned into intellectual property. So this is something I wanted to just raise, that internationalization as an entire program of activities from my perspective of where I sit, which is very particular to a small open economy in a globalized world, which is a very small economy, and it's also a knowledge economy. So yeah, anyway.
Stuart, I know that you had your hand up, but if you don't mind, this is sort of a co-supervisor's stepping in to say that Dale's dissertation, I just want him to speak a little bit about this. I'm co-supervising Dale with Jason Ellis in our department, and Dale has submitted his dissertation for defense later this month in July, and it quite, if I can just say, yes, clap for Dale, yay. His dissertation looks at how, exactly what you're saying, in Canada, how, well, I'll let you describe it, but it's, maybe what you could do, Dale, is also tell us what your original title for the dissertation was, and then where you shifted it now. But I think it really speaks to this kind of creation of a commodification, but for a particular purpose of internationalization.
Okay, that's very kind. Thank you, and thank you for the claps. So I did actually want to follow up on Suming's point about this project, because I have completed research into the discussion about the creation of particularly differential fees, but really the launching of internationalization as a project at universities in Canada, and at the governmental and the institutional level, it is very transparent. I think the funny thing about my dissertation is I think it kind of reveals things that, as we can see in these conversations, we all already know, which is that they were very transparent about the fact that this was about the transfer of wealth, and about, I think, particularly about propping up a failing social democratic structure there was no longer going to be a willingness to publicly fund it. And so this was a way to transfer wealth to keep it functioning, in Canada at least, functioning roughly, from the perspective of Canadians, functioning roughly in the same way. My original title for the dissertation was Envoys of Neoliberalism, which I have abandoned partly because of the problems around the term neoliberalism and the way people are struggling with it right now. But what I came to find was that this has a trajectory that grows out of this idea of monetizing international students, has a trajectory that grows out of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And actually, the thing I did want to add there was that picking up on something Roopa talked about in her really wonderful presentation. I mean, the videos, I agree the panel went together really well, and I've enjoyed every video I've seen, but was about the idea, the way that international students are framed as, when we think about the idea of internationalization as a fatal strategy, one of the things that I think, and I know that Amy, because Amy taught me this, would highlight about this, is that it's been a fatal strategy since the beginning of it as a financialized activity. It's been a fatal strategy for the global south all along. And it's always been a trajectory that's been about moving wealth from whatever we want to use, less wealthy countries, to the global north, in part to make up for the declining process of neocolonialism, or the limited profits that were being made from neocolonialism in the post, the Cold War period. And so I think, like, when we think about it as a failed strategy, there has always been this cost that's been unspoken and really borne by economies and by, of course, by human beings all over the world. Like, Canada's hugely profited from. I in some ways, I mean, as much as the United States and the UK and Australia and other recipient countries. Anyway, so I really do appreciate that acknowledgement. But I think, like, there's a specific historical trajectory to this. And Sue's point about it as propping up the declining funding, they were like, everybody actually said that. The president of the university at which I work right now, Simon Fraser University, said the reason they were going to charge differential fees was he said there's not enough money. The government has cut our money, and so we must find that money somewhere else. Anyway, sorry, I think I made Stuart wait quite a while there.
I just would like to bring a different point of perspective. As you all said, the strategy of internationalization for countries like Chile, Argentina, has been the other way around. So the states subsidize international students to bring them into the party, with very deep consequence to deepening our inequalities. But going back to this idea of complicity and the point that Tatiana made. So if in internationalization and the universities have been always serving the project of the state, is it possible, like, that in logical terms, that we can avoid that complicity to some extent? I mean, it's like, I think it's a harness. Like, you want, but actually there is no necessarily, I mean, I don't see if our assumption, if the representation that we are making is accurate, it seems that there is no way that we could avoid that complicity. We will be always in that state. And now the question for me is like, okay, I see the potentials for different understanding. The only fact that I can speak English was because of an internationalization policy that Chile adopted 10 years ago. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to talk with you. What do we do with this contradiction? Like, it has benefited in individual projects and also has repercussion at the meso and macro, but then there is all of those other tensions that constrain us. And I just bring the question. I don't think that we have I am not expecting a solution. And another thing that I really enjoyed so much from the presentations is maybe there is a process of death, like this cycle of completely burnt that we have to rethink and embrace it. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
Stuart, it's your turn finally.
All right, thanks, Sarah. I had some kind of semi-related thoughts. I mean, first of all, I thought the titles and the phrases, the concepts that all three of these presentations were really evocative and just really useful to work with. So thank you for that. I wanted to come back, I guess, to the kind of something I said in the previous session about this sort of shifting terrain and how it makes it tricky as a terrain shifts. Of course, I mean, something like hypermobility, of course, which is a massive characteristic of university life, and all of a sudden I can't even get out of my neighborhood. I can't even get to my physical campus here, right? And also the prospect that might continue here in London for a year or more. So these kind of shifts. But a couple of things on that. So one, I did a project a couple of years ago, looking here in the UK with the rise of more and more people getting large research grants. So there's a kind of move away from small research grants to large research grants. It was a hyper research grant thing. And so you had this fun with people getting large research grants and then lots of large research grants at the same time. And with that, rather than people doing research and going over to other countries, you know, for international research, going over to other countries and crossing borders, the principal investigators would stay put here in London. It would be subcontracted out, hiring people in, we were looking in Lebanon, it was research on Syrian refugees. And so it shifted to something else. You don't have that same kind of hypermobility, but it's morphed into something that's as problematic or maybe problematic in other ways, right? We now have, of course, with the international students here in the UK, I assume some kind of morphing into trying to construct some kind of transnational education. You know, we're at UCL, we have huge numbers of Chinese and East Asian students, and we'll have all this pressure to create online modules where the students are supposed to pay thousands and thousands of pounds and stay put in China and so forth. So it's a different kind of thing. It's as these discourses and practices shift, it's almost hard to kind of play catch up. Just as an example, at UCL where I am, where again, we have this incredible centralization of management decision making about everything. And so we have no input as staff about how we teach, about how the university is going to be run, about how to make this a public university. And so the push here is for all of us not only to do all online teaching next year, but all asynchronous. So we wouldn't even be able to do this, right? We just kind of post things. And you know, we can guess what the reasons are why the university would be interested in that particular model of online education. But how it's being promoted, put to us, is around equity issues. All of a sudden, we have this university promoting this discourse about how concerned they are about equity for Chinese international students, which never was part of the discourse before, right? And so suddenly this equity discourse is now internationalized, but it's being mobilized for, I would argue, very problematic sort of set of practices.
This reminds me a lot about Tatiana's point in the previous presentation about, so I can talk and resonate with these ideas of, you know, the fatal strategy, and I do. And then what do I do when I go to the committee, right? Because I've seen that even in my own program. You know, we have a study abroad component to one of our programs. The first year the students go to Vietnam, the second year they go to Italy for 1 week and 2 weeks respectively. So we were trying to launch another program, and the original idea was, let's bring them in once a month. And I said, look, the planet can't take this. And the response I got was, well, you know, we need to remain competitive. So I was thinking also of that point about, you know, we have to capitalize on the fact that we're in Chicago, that we're an attractive location. That was pre-pandemic, obviously, you know. And one of the things that Max and I talked about when we were trying to just wrap our heads around this notion of hypermobility was how right now we're in this kind of stasis, academic stasis, you know, we're staying in place and then trying to make that work. And in some ways it's made far more evident how this was a fatal project. But like Roxana talked about, you know, so what do I do with that contradiction? Because it's not going to go away. And for me, in some, actually, after hearing the presentations this week, I think I'm in a very different space than I was last week. You know, my thought has, I won't say evolved, but I'm grappling with all these things right now. And so this notion of reducing harm for me has become something a lot more more present. And if these are fatal projects, then maybe my role is simply to try to reduce harm to the point that I can. And in some ways, you know, I think that's also why these conversations are so important, because if we don't have these conversations, if we don't present an alternative of something we can build, even if it's flawed, even if it's incomplete, even if it ends up replicating some of the patterns that we're trying to avoid, and we're hearing these Canada first, America first. if we leave the internationalization space without an alternate, conceptual, intelligible conceptualization of internationalization, something else will creep in there, and that may be nationalization. Right now, that's one of the big ones, right? It may be something else. So in some ways, it's in some ways embracing that totality. I find that hopeful, because otherwise I see no other alternative right now. Maybe, but right now I can't see it. Max, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what we were saying about the hypermobility and stuff, or?
I don't know if I have anything particular to say about that, but I did want to, I've been trying to think about this. So I have agreed with many of the things people have said. From my past experience, I haven't been an international student for a degree program, just for short-term study abroad. But from my experience working with international students as an international student advisor, I feel drawn to trying to remember that internationalization is not just a project of institutions and of nation states. For many of the things we've already discussed, competitiveness, labor force augmentation in Canada, for example, but also the agency of students to decide to, and the international student mobility being a huge and perhaps one of the most visible parts of internationalization, and the agency of students to make those decisions, which is embedded in the world economy and the global knowledge economy and globalization and all of these various factors that might provide a rationale for students deciding to study abroad, but it still is decisions that they're making. And there are certainly issues with things like so-called brain drain, but there are also, it's not only one way movement of individuals. And I'm thinking about some research that I was really excited to come across, talking about diaspora knowledge communities. And so I'm not contradicting or contesting anything anyone said, but just trying to remember that internationalization isn't just nations making policy decisions and institutions making recruitment and competitive recruitment decisions, but also students making decisions to benefit themselves and their families and their home communities.
I wanted to also comment on Roopa's presentation with this idea of Canada first, and the many ways of I would almost call it like policy complicities that we have in a lot of our countries, where internationalization doesn't sit by itself, right? Internationalization as a national strategy or an institutional strategy often sits on top of other possibilities that are mitigated by policies or created by policies. And one of those in Canada, of course, is this concept of a pluralistic society and the valorization of multiculturalism as the answer to a changing demographic and sort of the erasure of what the erasure does, right? So like the sort of policy as a particular form of guilt assuasions, and how then that's possible. We're allowed to internationalize because we are already benevolent, right? We're already good. We're already very accepting, and we're not the United States, right? So there's this kind of always pushing forward this Canadian exceptionalism that Sharon has written about as well, and this kind of idea of one type of policy creates space for another type of policy. So I don't know if there's more you want to say about that. Certainly heard a lot of that in your presentation, Roopa.
But to me, it's been very interesting to see how we've positioned ourselves in relation to US policy, yet being not very different from that central policy itself. So I find that a fascinating sort of how we positioned ourselves has been fascinating, yet not being reflective or not being self-reflective at all in terms of our own policy. But the US has given us a lot of good times. We are very happy with Trump in office, is all I'd say.
I have a few comments now that I've like compiled, so I feel like I might be referencing things that we kind of moved beyond and hopefully adding a few things. So one is just I want to, since Max just mentioned this notion of, you know, individual choices, I also just want to emphasize or remind us, I guess, and I don't think he was saying that this wasn't the case, but that those student choices and desires are also part of this colonial imaginary. And whether they're, you know, pushing back on or sort of buying into it, like our desires are also part of this colonial structure. So yes, it's in the policies and in the national positioning, but it's also in us as individuals. So there's not like this innocent student or innocent faculty member. No one can be innocent in this totally fucked up world. But what I really wanted to speak to was so something that has kind of come out of a combination of this presentation and the last is that I'm getting the sense that there's like different layers of things that we need to be doing as maybe critical internationalization scholars. So we really have emphasized this need for the strategic intervention. We are on these committees. We do have some, usually tokenized, but nonetheless voice in these institutions and in this mode of harm reduction and in using the institutional resources in a hopefully generative way. We need to have those conversations and strategize with each other's and have each other's backs, even if it's not always backing each other up. We might not agree on everything, but how do we have each other's backs to support each other in that work? Then there's also this work of needing to dive deeply into the kind of horizons of imaginaries and possibilities that we are drawn to. And this is a longer term work that is about imagining otherwise and the impossibilities almost of doing that. And that is a different kind of work than the strategizing, and we shouldn't conflate them. We can think about how they're related to each other, and how, for instance, when we're doing the strategic work, we are bracketing some of those conversations, but we can't forget that we're bracketing. And then I think, and I missed the very last part of the last session because my audio crapped out, which I'm super upset about, but I got a recap that there was this discussion of our own sort of emotional states and embodied states in this, and really reminded me that we are also deeply and in embodied ways harmed by these institutions. We are traumatized by them, and that trauma is not evenly distributed. And there's also fragilities there that are not the same as the traumas. But I think there's an important role in healing for all of this work that is not the same as the other two layers. But we don't have healthy ways of dealing with pain. We don't have healthy ways of dealing with death, as Amy said. So we need to figure out what that work looks like. And it's very hard to think about that in this context, I realize, but I think we need all three of those layers and probably more. And then the last thing I want to say, sorry, I feel like I'm speaking a lot, is I really liked the questions Max and Blanca presented us with. I can't remember what you called it, but I did copy the questions and I'll even paste them here. And I did a crappy job transcribing, so apologies, I didn't get them right, but look in the actual presentation to get them. But I think there's also layers here. There's layers, so there, sometimes in my work we talk about methodological layers, so the layer of practice, epistemological layer, so that layer of different perspectives and political interventions in that strategic layer, and then also an ontological layer about who we are, what you know, time feels like, what our relationship is to the earth, these kinds of things. So your questions really resonate, I think, with the methodological and epistemological layer, and I'm wondering if another set of questions alongside it that invites these more ontological questions that is something beyond the carbon footprint, but actually about like what's our responsibilities to this earth as a living being that we are an extension of, and those kinds of questions that invite us to bring the conversation to a different place while keeping the, you know, strategic questions on the table as well. So those are just my thoughts on all the things.
if I could jump in just very briefly to react to this, because I think one of the meanings, I don't know if it's the right or the wrong one, of fatal strategy is this idea of reversing the argument, right? So for example, when we think about strategy, it's not that we strategize the world, right? It's not, or rather that's one way, then revert it, that's the fatal strategy, which is we are part of this larger strategy that we don't know about, right? And how do we position ourselves not outside of this game, but as being part of that, right? So I'm not the player of chess, I'm one of the pieces that could get off the board, right? If the strategist, whoever that may be, makes the wrong move, right? And I think this feels very real as the livelihoods of many people, but also the health and safety of many people, right? Like somebody else, right? Like nobody's asking us really if we want to go back or how we want to teach or how we would feel safe. There are larger decisions, right? And you know, like that's like we are asked to be put on the line, right, as a result of some of these decisions, right? And maybe this feels just very concrete now in the US, as many universities are rushing, trampling over each other to see who opens first and who feels like who is in the bigger denial that there is a pandemic taking place. So I think that's one of the ways, right, that fatal strategy is important, right? Because it's humbling, because we realize we're not the grand strategists, we are one of the pieces, right? And then we need to find agency from that position, because that's the realistic way of having change. I think we often overestimate our sense of agency over the things that are taking place.
I think sometimes silence is a good thing. But I'm also very aware that we're at the end of our hour. So I don't know if the presenters want to have a last word, or if anyone who hasn't said anything feels like they have something burning. Okay. Well, we will reconvene tomorrow at, well, 9 my time. That's various times for you all. If you have any questions in the meantime or something I can help with technically speaking or anything else, just let me know. Thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to Max, Blanca, Gerardo, Amy, and Roopa for their presentations for this session. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
I just want to say thank you, Sharon, for this very successful first Zoom workshop day.
Yes, thank you. It's been really super.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.